Eddie Van Halen revolutionized the guitar, influenced millions, and changed rock itself. But behind that unmistakable smile and mind-bending solos was a secret history of rivalries that few, if any, knew about. There were 6 guitarists whom he admired, argued with, and at times could not get along with. What was the reason for this strange, hidden tension between legends? And why would some of the all-time greats of rock show up on Eddie's unspoken hate list? Let's take a closer look at the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen reportedly disliked the most, starting with number 6, Eric Clapton. Before Eruption, before the ear-piercing crowds, there was a teenage Eddie Van Halen sitting in his Pasadena bedroom with a cheap guitar and a worn-out stack of Cream albums. Night after night, he dropped the needle on Crossroads, trying to capture every bend, every lick, every ounce of fire from Clapton's Les Paul. Clapton wasn't merely an influence. He was the reason Eddie picked up a guitar in the first place. In an interview to Guitar World, Eddie said, "Clapton was my biggest influence. I'd sit there for hours to try and get a handle on what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me." Of course, during those formative years, Eddie didn't think about fame or tone or songwriting. He just wanted to understand why Clapton's playing felt alive, the pauses, the sustain, the phrasing that encoded itself into Eddie's musical DNA. Time changes everything. By the late 1970s, Eddie had done what Clapton never did. He reinvented the electric guitar. When Eruption hit, it sounded extraterrestrial, like something from another planet. His two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, and dive bombs upended conventional guitar techniques. Almost overnight, this introverted kid from Pasadena was the future of rock. But not everyone was pleased. The older generation of musicians, the ones Eddie once idolized, wasn't impressed. In 1980, Clapton was asked his opinion of Van Halen, and his dismissive tone left Eddie stunned. "He's very good technically," Clapton said, "but I don't hear much soul." The comment devastated him. The man who inspired him in the first place called his playing mechanical. Years later, Eddie would admit, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." Eddie never fired back publicly. He never badmouthed Clapton in interviews. But friends said he quietly struggled with the disappointment of being rejected by his idol. Their conflict was partly one of philosophy. Clapton had built his playing on restraint and feel, a blues-rooted approach in which tone told the story. Eddie, in contrast, reveled in experimentation, distortion, feedback, and freedom. They represented 2 eras. Clapton epitomized the music of the 1960s. Eddie, the music of tomorrow. Still, despite the pain, Eddie's admiration never disappeared. In 1995, he said, "Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable. I don't care what anybody says. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that." The two finally met in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie was thrilled, a fan meeting his hero. Clapton was friendly but distant. They talked about guitars, tone, and amps, but there was no emotional connection. Later, Eddie told a friend, "He's just a man. I think I love the myth more than the person." That encounter changed him. It made him realize that legends weren't gods. They were just people, brilliant but flawed. When asked later if Clapton's words still bothered him, Eddie laughed. "Nah," he said. "Maybe he didn't understand. Maybe I didn't understand him either. We're from different planets, man." That line said it all. Clapton played in shades of blue and shadow. Eddie painted with neon light. After Eddie's death in 2020, Clapton reportedly spoke warmly of him in private, calling him a true innovator, though he never said so publicly. Fans who knew their story understood the unspoken respect behind those words. By then, Eddie had long made peace with it. In 2001, he told Guitar World, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." His admiration hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. "I'll always be chasing what I heard on those old Cream records," he once said. That's where the fire started. Eddie's sorrow over Clapton cut deep, but his next confrontation was even hotter. This time, it wasn't heartache, but rivalry. 2 guitar gods, 1 stage, and no room to bend. How did Eddie Van Halen square off against the dark sorcerer of the Stratocaster? That brings us to number 5, Richie Blackmore. Few things are more intense for a young guitarist than meeting an idol, especially when that idol is Richie Blackmore, the mysterious genius behind Deep Purple and Rainbow. For young Eddie, Blackmore wasn't just a guitarist. He was a prophet of tone. Eddie painstakingly learned Burn and Highway Star note for note, replaying them until his fingers bled. He envied Blackmore's precision, aggression, and the haunting sense of drama in every riff. To Eddie, Richie was one of the rare players who could make a guitar sound alive. When Van Halen's debut exploded in 1978, Eddie suddenly stood among the very men he'd idolized. He was no longer the teenager with a cheap Strat copy in his bedroom. He was now their equal, a modern guitar titan rewriting the rules of rock. But the dream turned sour when he finally met one of his heroes. In a 1982 interview with guitar players Jazz Obrecht, Eddie recalled their encounter. "He just stared at me," Eddie said. "Wouldn't say, hi, nothing. I was crushed. I thought, wow, I looked up to this guy my whole life and he just blew me off." That silence cut deeper than any insult. Eddie wasn't arrogant or conceited. He was disarmingly open, the kind of man who could talk for hours about gear, pickups, and wiring. He jammed with everyone, laughed easily, and carried no ego about his brilliance. What stayed with him about Richie Blackmore was not anger, but that eerie chill, the glazed look, the absence of warmth, the complete lack of human connection. Years later, he brought it up again. "People like Joe Perry and Richie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Barrage. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. No, nothing. I'm not that way." That phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," summed up the sting perfectly. Eddie had just unleashed Eruption, a solo that tore through the world of music, redefining what a guitar could do. It forced every other guitarist on earth to reconsider their approach. Yet, the same men whose posters once covered Eddie's teenage bedroom now looked at him not with admiration, but with suspicion, even disdain. Some of that came from Richie Blackmore's personality. He was notoriously difficult, even with his own bandmates. His mystique depended on keeping people at a distance. And when Blackmore was asked about Van Halen years later, his reply was part praise, part jab. "He's a good player," Blackmore said, "but I think he plays too many notes." That comment was debated for decades. Was it jealousy or old-school purism? In truth, it reflected a deeper divide between two eras of guitar playing. Blackmore belonged to a generation shaped by classical phrasing and precision, where every bend, every vibrato had deliberate intent. Eddie represented the opposite, the wild, explosive, free-spirited expression of late 20th century rock. Where Richie cultivated order, Eddie embraced chaos. It wasn't a feud so much as a clash between philosophies. Eddie embodied the new wave of Californian innovators, players who modified their amps, customized their guitars, and chased sounds no one else had imagined. Blackmore, on the other hand, was among the last of the disciplined British hard rock traditionalists, his style rooted in symmetry and structure. Still, Eddie never let that icy encounter turn into resentment. Years later, in a 1995 Guitar World interview, he said, "With understanding, I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy or didn't know what to say. But man, I worshiped that guy growing up. Still do." And in time, even Richie softened. In 2008, he told Classic Rock magazine, "Eddie Van Halen brought something new. I can't deny that. What he did with the whammy bar, the tapping, it was clever. He found his own voice." That single line was the vindication Eddie had once longed for. Their paths diverged. Richie drifted into medieval-inspired music with Blackmore's Night, while Eddie remained restless, always experimenting, always searching for a sound no one else could hear. By the time the world lost Eddie Van Halen in 2020, even the staunchest Blackmore loyalists had to admit what their idol finally did. Eddie was brilliant. He found something everyone else had been trying to find. The recognition came decades too late, but for Eddie, it was enough. Soon after, Eddie faced another kind of rejection, one laced with swagger and attitude. Number 4, Joe Perry. In 1978, Van Halen was the storm that had just broken across the sky of rock, music raw, electric, and unstoppable. Their debut album had begun shaking the airwaves, and Eddie Van Halen, only 23, was still that hungry kid from Pasadena, desperate to prove himself among the gods of guitar. Night after night on tour, he poured everything into his performances, shredding solos with a ferocity that felt like survival itself. But behind the amplifiers and the spotlight, something quietly gnawed at him, the cold indifference of the men he'd once idolized. One of them was Aerosmith's Joe Perry. Eddie recalled those early touring years in a 1982 interview with guitar players Jazz Obrecht. "People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes," he said. "Wouldn't say hello. Wouldn't be nice. Nothing. I'm not that way. Imagine it. You're the up-and-coming kid tearing through shows, giving everything you have night after night. And when you finally meet the legends whose pictures once hung on your wall, they can't even offer a smile or a nod. Just that distant, icy glare." Eddie suspected that Perry and others like Blackmore saw him as a threat. He summed it up simply in that same interview. They wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody because they would feel threatened. It wasn't bitterness, it was honesty. The rock world of the late 1970s was splitting down the middle. The old guard, led by players like Perry, had been all about bluesy swagger, groove, and grit. The new wave, with Eddie at its head, was all about precision, speed, and sonic innovation. Perry's sound was raw and heavy, built on grinding riffs and a sense of sleazy rebellion, a soundtrack for smoke-filled rooms and backstage chaos. Eddie's was bold, futuristic, and untamed. And while Perry's style defined the 1970s, Eddie's would shape everything that came after.